I'm the Senior Curator for Arts Reach and Special Projects, Corinne Ernie. And it is my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce you to Alicia Longwell, our Chief Curator. And she will be talking about women artists in our current exhibition, What We See and How We See, which is a 7-part exhibition in the second part of the museum. And you're all welcome to go and take a peek after her talk. And I know you all are familiar with Alicia, but I would still want to read her biography because it is really, really impressive. And I feel very blessed to be working with her every day. So Alicia is the Louis B. and Dorothy Cullman Chief Curator, Art and Education here at the Parrish, where she has pursued a special interest in the history of the art and artists of Eastern Long Island. She has organized numerous survey exhibitions accompanied by catalogs, including John Graham, Maverick Modernist in 2017, Jane Freilicher and Jane Wilson, Seen and Unseen in 2015, Malcolm Morley, Painting Paper Process in 2012, Dorothea Rockburn, In My Mind's Eye in 2011, Sand, Memory, Meaning and Metaphor in 2008, and North Fork, South Fork, East End Art Now in 2004, as well as solo exhibitions on the work of artists Barbara Bloom, Marston Hartley, Frederick Kiesler, Alan Shields, Esteban Vicente, and Jack Youngerman, who, as you all may know, just passed away, sadly. And she is the lead curator on the annual reinstallation of the Parrish 3,500 work permanent collection. So major publications on the Parrish collection include William Mary Chase, A Life in Art in 2014, American Landscapes, Treasures from the Parrish Art Museum in 2010, First Impressions, 19th Century American Master Prints from the Parrish Art Museum in 2010, and photographs from the William Mary Chase Archives with Ronald G. Pisano in 1992. Alicia received her PhD degree from the Graduate Center, City University of New York in 2007, where her topic was the early work of artist John Graham. She is currently organizing a retrospective of the work of abstract expressionist painter James Brooks, which will be on view this summer. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. Okay. This was a question posed by Linda Nochlin, the great art historian, in which she explores the institutional, as opposed to the individual, obstacles that have prevented women in the West from succeeding in the arts. She asked this with a great deal of temerity and a great deal of irony, and it's with some trepidation that I'm going to take on speaking about women in the collection, because you have to speak about women in the arts in a broader context. But I thought we should really begin with the talk to think about Linda Nochlin, that daring art historian who first posed this question, and we need to know something more about her. And she passed away just in 2017 after a long and extraordinary career. Now, who first posed this question, or should I rather say, who first posed this question to her? This is the article which came out in the January 1971 edition of Art News. It's a reprint of an article she wrote and later revised, but Tom Hess, the forward-thinking editor of Art News at that point, very much wanted to post it. So who first posed that question to her? She was attending a Vassar College graduation, the 1969 graduation ceremony. She was, in fact, teaching there then. It was the college from which she had graduated in 1948. And most of you will know that that, in fact, was an all-women's college at that time. She was listening to the commencement speaker, who was one Gloria Steinem. And Steinem had been invited by Brenda Feigen, who was a friend of Nochlin's, but more importantly for this story, the sister of the art dealer Richard Feigen. Richard Feigen turned to Linda and said, "Linda, I would love to show," he was a prominent New York art dealer, "Linda, I would love to show more women artists, but I can't find any good ones." Well, why are there no great women artists is exactly what he said to her in the middle of the Vassar graduation. So she went home, she says, and she thought about the issue. She says it haunted her. She had certainly heard about women's liberation I already knew she has said that she was liberated in her own mind, and I knew enough about feminism, suffragettes and such, she said, to realize that we in 1969 were beyond such things. But it made me think, she said, first of all, because it implied that there were no great women artists, and secondly, because it was assumed that this was a natural condition. It just lit up my mind. It stimulated me to do a great deal of further research in a variety of fields in order to answer the question and its implications. She virtually trailblazed from that moment on the field of feminist art history and feminist art theory, and it should not be forgotten that it was not just a necessary, that this should not just be a necessary corrective, or in Nachman's words, is something to be grafted on to serious discipline, but it was going to be a revolutionary project. She wrote, and this is the opening pages, obviously, for the publication in Art News. She said, and this is part of the article, "In the arts, as in 100 other areas, things remain stultifying, oppressive, and discouraging to all those, women included, who did not have the good fortune to be born white, preferably middle class, and above all, male. The fault lies not in our stars, our hormones, our menstrual cycles, or our empty internal spaces, but in our institutions and our education. Education understood to include everything that happens to us from the moment we enter head first into this world of meaningful symbols, signs, and signals. The miracle is that, given the overwhelming odds against women, so many of both have managed to achieve so much excellence, if not towering grandeur, in those bailiwicks of white masculine prerogative like science, politics, or the arts. Don't forget this was written half a century ago." She divides her argument into several sections, but this is the wonderful cover of the Art News, that January issue, which I think you see Tom has deciding just what would make a wonderful cover. Reproduces the 1801 portrait of Marie-Joséphine Charlotte Duval-Donne from the Metropolitan Museum collection, of course, which since its acquisition in 1917 for many, many years was assumed to be Jacques-Louis David, one of the most famous painters of the 18th and 19th century. The choice of the painting was pertinent that he chose, not only because it depicted a woman drawing, albeit probably a woman of some high breeding, but because it had recently been reattributed to a woman painter, Constance Marie Charpentier, who was working in David's studio at the time. I will just say that was not an unusual occurrence. Sometimes painting coming out of the master studio could be for more sinister reasons, passed off as the master's, not even by David per se, but perhaps by an ambitious dealer. The purchase price in 1917, it was bought by one Isaac Dudley Fletcher, who seems to have been only a manufacturer, but it was given to the Met. In 1917, he paid $200,000 for it. So he obviously thought it was a David. An Art News editorial describes the portrait as perhaps the greatest picture ever painted by a woman. That's Tom Hess speaking. 9 years later, interestingly enough, the painting was reattributed to another artist, Marie-Denise Villiers, who also worked in David's studio. And the Met, getting somewhat unsettled by the reattributions, decided they would just cautiously name it as Young Woman Drawing. How many of you know this painting? You must, yeah. I mean, it's a really extraordinary work, and with that really amazing history. So this was on the cover of the Art News magazine. Now, one thing that Nachlan noted about teaching at Vassar and having attended Vassar, she said the good thing about a women's college was that women had a chance to do everything. We were not pushed to the margins because there were no gendered margins. We were all there. And here she is speaking in the late 90s. She was a favorite subject of some of her artist friends. In the middle, you see with her husband, Richard Palmer. This is in the 1980s. And on the right, a portrait by Philip Pearlstein. And on the right, a portrait by Alice Neal. She's seen there with her daughter, Daisy. This is a photograph of her teaching at Vassar. When she graduated from Vassar, she obtained a master's degree in English literature at Columbia and then undertook her PhD in art history at the Institute of Fine Arts, where she wrote her doctorate on a towering bastion of male dominance, one Gustave Courbet. And soon she was working with her all-female male students at Vassar. This is after her, you might say, questioning of were there no great women artists. In Vassar, she was working on 19th century realist paintings, another of her great fields of interest, and the hagiography of such histories. Nochlin argued that histories in terms such as great and genius are loaded with unquestioned, often unconscious meta-historical premises, compounded with art history's romantic and elitist and individual glorifying and monograph producing substructures. I mean, books are written on the most famous artists, the most widely known artists, the most widely seen artists, and it often lets people out of the canon or leaves people out. She demonstrates the fact that by their outlining certain patterns in art history, in historical biographies, that discover genius. Do we all know the story of Vasari, who wrote about Giotto, who went out and was a shepherd boy, and he would draw pictures of the sheep on a stone? Probably didn't happen, but it makes a very good story. Like Vasari, you know, as good as the one is of Jackson Pollock watching his father urinate on a rock and seeing the arcs and swirls of that on there, which inspired him to drip paintings. It's another great story invented by an art historian. So most women, truly it was, most women artists before the 19th century were either daughters or wives of artists and were trained by their male relatives. Unlike their male counterparts, however, they were not allowed academic training or the study of anatomy. Therefore, they usually had to limit themselves to the arts of portraiture and still life, many examples of which we know. Nochlin went on to sort of categorize some known women artists, just to prove that all the great ones were not with the particular chromosome. This is the two images, the left and the center, are by a nun whose name we know as Inda. She lived in 10th century Spain, and she and a monk, Emeterius, we assume they were good friends because they painted right on the same codex together, which is a fairly large piece of vellum. They did the well-known now Apocalypse of Girona, which is the whole story of the apocalypse with 100 pictures and some of the best known and preserved masterpieces of the 10th century, which were signed, and she is a known figure in that realm. The church and synagogue on the two sculptures on the right are the portal sculptures, the ones that stand in Gothic cathedrals right by the entrances on the south portal of the cathedral at Strasbourg. And on the left is the church, on the right is the synagogue. These are by Savina von Steinbach, who in fact was the daughter of the head stone cutter and carver who worked on the cathedral. He died. She took over the entire program and finished it in a really extraordinary moment in the early 13th century, 1225. And don't forget the Bayeux tapestry, which after all was embroidery, celebrating the Norman conquest of England, and it's well believed it was probably designed by a woman and executed by nuns. Now, anonymous, certainly in that case, was a woman. Perhaps now into the Baroque era, and also this illustrated the first page of the article in Art News with good reason. This is one of the greatest painters known. She stands in comparison to no one in Baroque painting, except she and Caravaggio was certainly painted at the same time, perhaps unknown to one another. This is Judith and the maidservant with the head of Holofernes. It's a chapter from the Book of Judith, which is part of the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition, which was excised from the Protestant tradition, perhaps for its bloodiness. This is a scene, biblical but beloved by painters because you could really get in there and have a pretty dramatic scene. This is the story of, let me name the artist first. It's, of course, the great Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a Roman. Her father was a famous painter. She was trained by him, and she distinguished herself throughout the Baroque period with her painting. The story is, of course, as of the Jewish leader Nebuchadnezzar sending Holofernes into, he was the king of Nineveh, and he wanted to subdue his enemies, the Jews. He sent Holofernes in. Judith pretty much decided, she was a young widow, that if she tried to seduce Holofernes, she got him drunk enough, and then she called on her maidservant, beheaded him, and they triumphed over the forces of Nebuchadnezzar. So this is a well-known story. It's a historical story. And it gave every chance for this kind of dramatic scene. This is a large-scale painting, as you know. Many of you have seen, I'm sure. And it's also interesting that she was, in fact, the victim of rape by an artist named Agostino Tassi. It was a trial that went on for 2 years because, of course, no surprise, Tassi tried to establish that she was consensual in this, but she won that trial, which was very unusual at that period in the 17th century in Italy, and really extraordinary painter. On the right is a work by Judith Lester. It's called The Jolly Toper. No, it's not a Frans Hals. I mean, you could certainly say this was a very popular genre at the time, the sort of drunk guy at the local pub, you might say. And she signed them with a J, and everyone really should have known that it wasn't a Frans Hals, but it really wasn't discovered until later in the 17th century. This is one of the earliest known works by her, and she apparently did this at the age of 19. She was also trained with, not with Hals, but with other artists. There was a Swiss-born painter named Angelica Kaufmann, and these are all examples that Nochlin uses just to try to amplify the story of things. And believe me, this is half a century on. 50 years ago, aside from Artemisia Gentileschi, very few of the other painters I'm mentioning, those histories were even known. So it was much more radical article in that sense of bringing new work to light. Angelica Kaufmann on the left was born in Switzerland. She came to London, studied there, became a very, very popular and in-demand neoclassical painter, as you see the beautiful portrait of the Three Graces on the left. And on the right, as she was inducted, this is interesting, she was inducted into the Royal Academy. And in this 1772 painting by Zoffani, I guess in discretion she was not there, but you can see her portrait up on the right-hand wall up above, which I think is wonderful. Her portrait is there even, well, there's apparently a nude model lower right, so that's why she's not there. But she was a member of the Academy. Very well known for a long time, was really throughout the history of the 18th century, was Vigie Lebrun. She was enormously popular at the French court, mainly because she painted Marie Antoinette in these lovely motherly scenes of the caring mother with her little children. Not so much the image we have of Marie Antoinette down at the Petit Trianon with her sheep, but I mean, playing the shepherdess, perhaps. So Vigie Lebrun was very, very popular at the French court. On the left is a very sweet portrait she did of her own little girl. Portrait of the artist's daughter with that wonderful reflection. I think she probably hoped her daughter, if she were an artist, would have an easier time than she did. Very famous painters like Tintoretto, his daughter Marietta studied under him, and her work went out into the world and passed off as Tintoretto, which often happened. So we have to really know that women have produced works through time in the same league as the modern masters that we know. And this is the point that Nochlin at every turn wants to get across in this article. These are two works by the daughters of James Peale, who was the brother of the famous Peale family. They too, I would have to say, I don't want to present these women as abject in any way. They were painters, they made good livings as portrait painters, and they were also, still life, of course, was a genre that has always in demand, was collectors, and they were able to establish careers in that way. They seldom got the full credit that they should have in looking back on art history. And I'm sure many of you know this painting by the indomitable Rosa Bonheur, who seems unique in many ways in the annals of 19th century French painting. She wore trousers, but she always said it was because she had to go, and this is the horse fair in Paris. So she loved to paint the horses. She went down to the horse fairs, so she had to wear the trousers so she could get around in the muck. And she also studied anatomy, she dissected, she has this extraordinary tradition of the animalier and painting artists with all, painting horses and other animals with all their correct musculature, and this, fabulous frenzy there at the fair. The picture upper right, a photograph, this is from the Paris Exposition Universelle in 1889. That's none other than Buffalo Bill there, who got around. And they were a sensation at the fair. And she was there because he was a great fan of hers as well. Chief Rocky Bear, Chief Red Shirt, and various other assorted people that traveled with Buffalo Bill and his show. A name you may not have heard about is Candace Wheeler. She studied art. She was also very interested in, this is after the Civil War, so many young women were, and all ages of women were widowed. They needed to make a living. They needed to do something which perhaps they hadn't been prepared to do because they had gone into married life. She established the New York Society of Decorative Art, where women were learned how to paint various decorative materials, both for furnishings and for wall hangings, and made a real contribution not only to decorative arts, but to the sort of a societal place for these women to go. You can imagine large numbers who were left to their own devices after the Civil War and had to make a living to support their families. So she's Candace Wheeler is very well known for this work, and also for the beautiful designs that she did as well. Now, women, of course, were going to art schools in the late 19th century. Lower right is a picture of Thomas Eakins, 1885, of course, at the Pennsylvania Academy. Now, as you see, all the students are women, and curiously, what kind of model are they drawing from? Can anyone tell what that is there in the picture? Well, it's a cow. I guess a cow is a little more docile to bring into a studio than a horse. But yes, the women had to, it's a model, and you can do muscle and such and musculature, but it is a cow. So they had to have separate. They were not allowed to be in the. Eakins railed against this. He thought it was ridiculous, and that's one of the things that got him in big trouble there at the Academy. But at that point, they had to, their life model was a cow. This is a painting by Emily Mary Osborne. I have to say, a painter which I'm, to this day, I'm not totally familiar with, but it's very, very typical of British painting in about the middle of the 19th century. This is called Nameless and Friendless, and this is narrative art at its height. It's a three-hanky painting, which was extremely popular with collectors. And in the same way that Dickens told stories in serials from week to week, these became very popular as illustrations, of course, for magazines. Printing was much cheaper and easier to do, and much more widely read with serialized novels like Dickens. And she is, we assume now, perhaps not reading too much into this, either trying to sell her own painting or one she owns to this dealer who is, as we can see, probably deciding how little he could possibly pay her. She has her young son there, we assume, who, although we can't really, he has a very determined look that he's giving this dealer, as if to say, you should give my mother a very good price on this. And yet we see the mother here, probably a widow, judging by her clothing, and she's sort of nervously playing with this string with her fingers, if you can see that small detail. Layers and layers of information, of pattern, of dark and light, wildly popular at that period. And Osborne was a painter who really delivered with these scenes and enjoyed an enormous career at that point. Anyone know that work or those paintings? It's sort of a discovery when you see these. Now, Nochlin did a show called Women Artists 1550 to 1950, which was organized by the LA County Museum of Art back in '77. And in 1988, she finally did a show on Courbet, where it's rather ironic, this bastion of male painterly genius of the 19th century, which is where Courbet is the apotheosis of him. And interestingly enough, I'll have to say the lower right painting should be seen through a feminist lens. That's the first time that painting had been shown publicly ever since it was painted in the 19th century. It was painted as a private commission by Courbet for an Egyptian-Turkish dealer who lived in London. Since this painting was apparently Courbet, after having done the painting, which has a full head and the rest of the body, actually, appendages, it was not cut up like this to begin with, but Courbet felt that he really did not want to subject the model to what would be the singular male gaze of this collector. So in fact, I don't have the picture of the painting, but the head of the painting, which shows the woman's head back, looking up, has been discovered, identified, authenticated. It is in fact the top of the painting which he had. So Nochlin brings to Courbet sort of the scrutiny he did not have, certainly in his lifetime or in the earlier part of the 20th century, by art historians to look at those paintings. I always thought it was interesting. Realism was her field, and Courbet was certainly in the pantheon of those painters. And interesting that this was a male painter that she devoted this study to. But I wanted to talk a little bit. Now that's the background. Are you with me there? I just thought it would be interesting to talk about some of this prehistory, as it were. Who's read 9th Street Women? It's very interesting. 9th Street, because was where you might say this is where women artists in New York were really first able to have their work more widely shown. It was a lot more pluralism on 9th Street as opposed to 57th Street or anywhere higher on the Upper East Side. 9th Street women gathered here, and the photograph taken some years later at the opening of Helen Frankenthaler's show at Tibor Danache, but that's Helen Frankenthaler in the center. On the left is Joan Mitchell, and on the right, Grace Hartigan. And you will see that the 9th Street women are, in fact, ones on the list there in the poster from 1951. It was basically the forerunner of an artist collective, or artists that got together and, either rented a space and whitewashed the walls and brought everything in. And that was one of the first, although there are only 6 women in that list of artists, it was one of the first times that the women were really brought into a show, recognized as part of this lower downtown New York movement with the galleries that gathered around 9th and 10th Street in the Village, names like Tanager. This was, in fact, a temporary show that was, as I say, organized by a collective. And this sort of launched these careers, or at least gave these women artists a whole lot more exposure. I will say there's one other artist besides their 5, of course, treated in 9th Street Women, in addition to the ones in the photograph, also Lee Krasner and Elaine de Kooning, who are also in the 9th Street show. But the other woman painter is Sonia Sekula, who was in fact a Swiss artist who came to the States, but was very much a part of the abstract expressionist movement. All the rest are male artists. It's a very interesting read. It's a lot of history in the book, I think. It goes rather quickly, although it's a giant tome like that. Really gives you insights into this period and some of the difficulties they faced, both as women and as women artists in this period. So, I was going to talk about the women on view here. I wanted to focus in on 3 of really extraordinary artists whose work is on view. This is the work of Pearl Fine, an artist who, she and her husband, Maurice Berezoff, moved out to the East End, built a house in the 1950s, a house in studio, and we have a picture of that later on. This is a fairly early work. Upper left is a photograph of she went to the Hans Hofmann School of art. This is a photograph from the Provincetown. He had the Provincetown venue in the summer, which appealed to artists then as now. He was, of course, the famous German émigré, expressionist painter who really, by all accounts, and many people studied with him, Helen Frankenthaler and L. Blaine, and he was a major proponent of women artists as well. And he had a theory there of push-pull, is what he called it, which really is not much more than the idea of receding and receding planes coming and dynamism in a painting, to make it quite simply. Either people came out of that painting just like Hoffman, or they went their own path, which is what most of the artists did. Pearl Fine said she always wanted to get away from his strict instructions, as did Helen Frankenthaler. But this is a wonderful painting from about that same period when she would have studied with Hoffman, probably late 40s. And that is on view in the gallery. We don't have a lot of paintings from this period, so it's wonderful to be able to show that early development as well. Her husband was Maurice Berzoff, also an artist, but worked also as a commercial photographer. Took a lot of photographs. He was in the city most by the 50s. Pearl Fine moved out here, really stayed out here because they built this wonderful large studio that Maurice had built for her. And she really preferred to be here. She loved the other artists out here and being sort of a part of that group. Maurice was a wonderful, he has huge archives of photographs that he took of artists particularly here on the East End. You probably know those well, that you've seen reproduced in books and shows of his work. And I often think that, like Hans Namath photographing Pollock, Pearl had this wonderful opportunity of having, or not opportunity, but we have this legacy of seeing her with her paintings at work that Maurice took, which, look what we take from photographs, as records of what has happened and reproduced in books and seeing them in slideshows. But you really get a feeling for sort of the atmosphere of the time, I think. That's the quite beautiful large studio, which is no more, here in Springs. Look at the height there. That must be as high as our galleries, right? So good 30 feet of that wonderful north light. This also wonderful painting from 1950, Plan for the White City, rather enigmatic title. It was never described that I know anywhere. And on the right, a smaller drawing, a work on paper, but you can see the collaged effect. And what's interesting about Fine is that so often she liked to use other materials in her work. If you go back and look at the painting on the left, which is on view, you'll see this, there's sand in it on the surface. That's not unusual. A lot of artists were doing that. A lot of the Avex artists were putting sand in their work, but it always, seems to me sort of a wonderful thing of artists. Might have been a commercial grade sand that they purchased, might have been something they picked up at the beach, but to really introduce this texture, which was a real idea then of sort of enlivening the surface. And on the right, this really beautiful, small scale, but interesting. She often worked by collaging elements in drawings. And this, you can see, that's a newspaper that she has folded and bent, and often will even affix double layers of paper to the surface of the work of art. So, are people familiar with Pearl Fine and her work? I think, yeah, there was a large show, everybody counts numbers here. There was a large show of abstract expressionist women painters that the Denver Museum about 5 years ago now. It did not come to the East Coast, but a big, important show, and Pearl Fine was in it. It was a sort of not just the usual suspects in the show, so to speak. This is Jennifer Bartlett. Jennifer, like many young artists, born in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s, really came up by the time they hit college and art school. Abstract expressionism was dominant. It was a little unclear to these young artists where they might go, and there was almost a whole generation that also came after. Abstract expressionism was taught somewhat also We have the intervening pop and minimalism also during those periods. So that's a lot to take in. A younger artist getting out of school, she went to Mills College in California, an all-women's college at that time. And she then went to graduate school at Yale. She was there with Richard Serra, trying to think who else, Chuck Close. And that period, all these artists were looking for another way to approach their work. She said, if you see this work in the gallery, this is 1 foot line. It's on view in the spine, going back towards the end of the galleries. It's, of course, the 1 foot is the white in between that you see. She was looking for a way not to paint on canvas, not to paint on paper, not to put a mark on any other kind of support. She wanted a rigid support. I think it's interesting you see her there on the floor working on that piece, which is what she did. She liked to sit and work on the piece in that way. She discovered these steel plates, those are foot square plates. She liked the rigidity of that support. And in what you would say is, of course, a minimalist gesture, she gridded it off in little squares, 1-inch squares. But all the plates are gridded off in that sense, making tiny squares. And in each tiny square, she took enamel paint on a very thin brush and put a mark. If you look closely, you will see that these are not perfect circles, although that's what they look like if you look casually. But otherwise, you will see that each one is a separate mark. So she is making this mark, and she's doing it on this surface. And as you may know, having seen her big pieces like Rhapsody at the Museum of Modern Art, which was in, is it still called the Atrium, on the big space, and it completely envelops that space. And this tells a narrative story between abstraction and figuration. There are always things you can see, like a house or a wave, but then there's a good deal of abstraction, and that's how she frames that narrative. But she's working in this gridded, in this increment, in this sort of elemental increment at vast scale. When a Rhapsody was first shown in 1976, it took up the whole of Paula Cooper's gallery. It's in fact 987 1-foot square steel panels. Together they represent what Bartlett called something that had everything in it. If you read from left to right, you see a mountain, a lion, a house, a L-I-N-E, line, a house, a tree, a shape. It was supposed to look like a conversation, she said, in which people digress from one thing and maybe come back to the subject, then do the same with the next thing. She was talking about in the earlier series she's done, she said one was abstract and one was figurative. I think that an abstract painting is actually more figurative than a figurative painting because it frequently is closer to the thing it is depicting. If you paint a red square, you have a red square of a certain measurable dimension. If you paint a vase of flowers, the vase of flowers is not measurable, more abstract than the red square. So you can see that this mind works in this extraordinary way. As I say, she was at Yale with Bryce Martin and Richard Serra. She was a great friend with Elizabeth Murray, and these are artists that really sort of reinvented ways to make art. Many of this so-called process generation, many of these artists that came to prominence for very good reason were women. You come to a movement in art where you finally have some parity between the number of men and women, and that's, I think, just it's a generational factor as well, and it's a factor of everyone sort of looking at our values and our hierarchies and coming to the conclusion that this is, it won't, I don't think too many dealers now would say, like Richard Feigen, find me a great woman artist. There are many. Oh, here's another. This is a picture of Jennifer on the left. She's also an exquisite, this is a oil and pastel. This one is not on view, 1-foot line is, but someone who always is not very far from nature despite what you might think of sort of a minimalist approach in some of her work. This is a beautiful small painting that is in our collection, not on view at the moment. So I wanted to end with a little look, and why shouldn't we? This is when we should have had good vibrations coming over the airwaves here. As I say, Mary Heilman has a great playlist. I mean, I'm sure she changes it all the time. Mary, about 15 years ago, I think, built a house here on Narrow Lane in Bridgehampton. And she had a little property next to it, and she rented out to 2 young farmers who wanted to grow corn. She said, please, grow some corn here. It would be so beautiful to look out and see it. So I think she still has that patch. Mary, born in California, born and raised with surfing brothers. She said she always wanted to be the surfer. She, was an artist who sort of came up knowing that what it was, postmodernism was all about. It was about not really being hemmed in by anyone's style, really finding your own bliss in that sense. She, doing more geometric work, and then basically just bit by bit began to find her own voice in that sense. Here she is on the right, sitting in her, Mary loves chairs, actually. Designs a lot of, she's a fabulous ceramist, and does a lot with cups as well, cups, plates, these sort of the accoutrements of home, and also wonderful chairs, which you'll see in the next thing. But Narrow Lane is indeed her address. I don't think we're giving away too much here. It's not. We don't have a map to the stars like they do in Hollywood, but she is right over in Bridgehampton, and this to me is always, there's something very uplifting about Mary's work and the way in which she comes back to the themes. This is Narrow Lane number 3. This is, someone asked her after she'd moved out here, starting to notice this sort of bright, lime green in her painting, and said, did that happen after you moved out to the country? And Mary went, yeah. And Mary, in her fashion, she said, I think it did, now that you mention it. It's really crept into my art. She spends a great deal of time here now. She still has a studio in the city, but Heilman has been, how do you get discovered, after you've been painting for about 45 years, but something in the sensibility and the work which is extraordinary and has been widely shown now, really in America and Europe, in the US and in Europe. And there's a wonderful clip that she did from a show installed at the Whitechapel Gallery several years ago, but she's talking right in the middle of her installation, and I thought it would be a wonderful moment. We can't listen to too many 19th and earlier century artists, but it's wonderful to have something like this. So from the Whitechapel in 2016.
I think what people get to see when they come here is about a 45-year survey of what I've been doing this whole time. If a person spends time looking at them, they can kind of get a sense of what I've been thinking about this whole time. These paintings are basically finger paintings. I made the image by either scraping through the paint to the undercoat or by squeezing through the paint with my fingers. I was teaching little children at the time, and that was something we often did together. Finger painting. I think because I was a sculptor, I thought about the whole canvas, the stretcher bars, the side, not the back, but the rest of it as part of the piece. This is interesting because the painting here is called Black Cracky, and it refers to probably cracking ceramics, but some kinds of a crack. And then I like this arrangement because it makes almost like one statement about all of the different kinds of ways of where hard forms happen when they break. The triangular one here is a cup sculpture. I like how it looks like it's speeding along because it has these drips that are flying in the opposite direction from the point. And we arranged it that way to emphasize that. I'm happy in this room because we've used my chairs, and I like the chairs because it makes people stay longer. And I like to sit down and look at the work and talk about it. This red painting is called Bush of Ghosts, named after a Brian Eno, David Byrne album. My own story about that is that it reminds me of a figure hiding behind a bush. So it's like it's a ghost hiding behind a bush. This piece is called Good Vibrations. And as we installed a show a couple of years ago, we put the two paintings together, and they're a diptych. They make one piece. And then the spots were separate pieces. They were all different individual sculptures. But as we arranged them in the room, we realized that the relationship of the spots on the painting and the spots on the wall really went together. And the title Good Vibrations spoke to the idea of the 60s hippie era, when people actually sometimes saw spots flying around on the wall as a result of certain substances that were flying around, like the spots. My thinking for my whole life has been inspired by popular music, and so lots of the titles are about songs that I've loved. When I was a kid, my father was a body surfer. We always were on the beach watching him body surf, and we went in and would dive under the waves. This one, Crashing Wave, is a pretty realistic picture of a wave. I'm loving it because of that. I think it's a really good example of a way to look at my work. I'm liking it, and I assume that people will like it just as much as I do. I hope.
I'm loving it too. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you tonight. I hope you'll enjoy seeing the exhibition again. Thank you. Okay.